If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel McLeod and Darnell Samuels.
Man, I hope after this streak, the audience has a sense of absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Man, another wonderful interview. And yeah, exactly. I hope so too.
Hope they want to hear us talk, for just me and you going back and forth.
But this is good. It's good to have another 2 cents to add to our 2 cents.
Yeah, keep the conversation, especially with things that, people will definitely think we're not qualified to maybe speak on. So.
Yeah, well, I prefer the term division of labor. There's just certain things you and I are not strong in, areas we're not strong in. So it's always good to bring in people that are stronger than us in the area. So with that said,
we have Deanna McLeod, who's the principal and lead strategist for Kaleidoscope Strategic. Deanna, why don't you give the audience a little bit of context of what that entails and how you become or became interested in, COVID and all that is.
Yeah, good question. So, I'm the principal and founder of the medical research firm called Kaleidoscope Strategic, and our group of researchers focus in oncology, which is cancer research. We started off in 2000, and I came out of 10 years in industry and decided saw that a lot of the way that treatment decisions were being made sometimes were skewed towards pharma products in a way that wasn't really independent or balanced. And so the other factor that was kind of interesting is that in Canada, there's a lot of different views on how things should be treated across provinces. And so I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could launch an independent research firm that would do, balanced evidence-based evaluations of treatments. And so I launched that in 2000. And so we've been at this for like 21 years now. The team's grown, which has been great. And we've really come to specialize in sorting through evidence, particular published literature, clinical evidence on treatments, and packaging them up and working with doctors. So we've got a network of about 500 doctors in Canada that we support in making clinical treatment decisions. And so we've published about 40 treatment guidelines that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, a lot of them very high impact and kind of leading journals. And so we specialize in parsing data. We've got a background in, our team has a background in immunology, molecular biophysics, molecular oncology, molecular biology. We've got years of industry experience. We've got clinical folks on the team too. So I think what our team does is we really understand how a lot of different fields work together. We understand how to parse through data and weigh evidence to see if something is a good decision or a bad decision in terms of whether it will benefit the patient. And I think unique to our particular perspective is we have a bird's eye view. And one of the things in, treatment is that we have a lot of silos in medicine. So, if you're a surgeon, surgery, and then you rely on your medical oncology colleague to do, medical oncology. In the COVID scenario, you've got your epidemiologist, you've got your public health official, you've got your immunologist, and all of them know their particular areas very well, but it's not as common to see people who have a facility across a number of different therapeutic areas and disciplines. And so I think that our team basically works really well together to do that. And so, Joel, you were asking, how we got into the whole COVID thing, and clearly we're specializing in oncology, so that doesn't really match very well, right? But as with everybody else in March 2020, we were all of a sudden like in a pandemic and we're locked down and we're like, oh, this is strange. Like, wow, this must be really serious. We're kind of nerds and we crunch data all the time. And so we were crunching numbers and, comparing things. And, one of the things that we started to notice that it was very peculiar in the sense of how things were being conveyed and decisions that were being made, i.e., interventions, that weren't necessarily supported by a high level of data. And so we thought, wow, this is kind of strange. This shouldn't really be happening based on this level of evidence. This isn't the threshold that you would look to have practice changing data. So, we all started getting curious, kind of like you guys, and started digging in a little bit more. And
Sorry,
so one of the things go ahead.
I wanted to,
sure.
when you say changing, the interventions, I'm just to clarify, are you referring to sort of, we had these pandemic response plans or preparedness response plans, and the things that we're doing were outside of those and sort of not backed up by data? Is that what you're referring to when you say?
Yeah. Well, I think that what you're saying is true, but what I was referring to particularly is, for instance, the way that they were conveying the numbers initially related to the pandemic. So, for instance, they would be saying, there's this many cumulative cases in such and such a country, and there's a cumulative cases in this, and the cumulative, and then now we have this many cumulative cases, and it seemed, basically from our perspective, what that is a lack of contextualization of data. So basically, it's not asking good questions from the data, and it's choosing the most dramatic element of the data to emphasize. And it seemed very strange to us that they were always emphasizing cumulative cases. They weren't breaking it down by demographic. They weren't talking about cases over time. The data was very clunky, I guess is what you would refer to initially. And so we thought that was very strange and lacked a little bit of sophistication and finesse. And it kind of got our like, you'd expect more from the World Health Organization and the CDC and, these bodies that we really, admire. Right. But, I think with everybody, we're like, okay, it's all new. We don't know what we're doing. We don't have a lot of data. So I hope that whoever is running the show is making some good decisions, and then I was like, hey, vacay. Life got a lot more simpler. We were at the cottage. I was like, this ain't bad, But when I'm talking about interventions, so that's kind of data analytics was a little bit light. When I'm talking about interventions, it was things like the World Health Organization having a position in 2019 with respect to lockdowns that basically said the harms outweigh the benefits, right? And then suddenly in 2020, that position changed, and it was based on data coming from China related to the lockdown. And of course, that's what you would call a case report. That's one case where a lockdown might have worked, right? But it is definitely not a threshold for practice change. So we thought that was very curious. Usually you need something much more rigorous in order to support that kind of an intervention or that kind of a practice change. And then we thought it was very strange too that, it was the statement on the World Health Organization changed without really any, evidence to support it, right? It's not like they said, oh, it was based on this, and we know that this doesn't meet the threshold for change, but we think it's really important, and we're doing it based on a precautionary principle. It was just like, nope, this is now the way it is. So we thought that was, again, very curious. So what you call that would be is an unsubstantiated and unsupported practice change. So again, we're like, that's odd. And of course, we specialize in oncology. So, multimodality treatment is how it goes. Like if you've got cancer, you're going to do surgery, you're going to do radiation, you're going to give some chemotherapy, maybe some biologics. You've got a lot of tools in your toolkit. And so when we analyzed the situation in China, what we noticed was that they did early response. They did central quarantine, they did symptomatic and asymptomatic testing, and they did localized lockdowns that lasted a maximum of 2 months. So that intervention was multimodal and short-lived. And so in the cancer world, what you'd say is they cut the tumor out. They got the tumor out. And then what we've done in the Western world, which is very curious, is to say, well, they cut the tumor out and they got rid of the virus. So then lockdowns work. So then we we didn't respond early. We didn't do the proper testing. We didn't do central quarantine. But we're going to do prolonged lockdowns, which is kind of like a palliative approach, and hope that we get the same results as what they got in China. So then basically that would be a misapplication of data. So
that's interesting. So I guess for those people who skipped statistics and don't know how to handle data, because sometimes it could be overwhelming getting numbers from every side. What are some tips and tricks you can suggest for those of us who aren't numerically inclined to analyze the data and break it down?
So one of the things that we've done is develop a YouTube channel called covidsence. And I can provide you the link for your show notes. But that basically has a whole video on how to navigate data and how to contextualize it so that you can understand and make better decisions. So that's kind of just the numbers that you would see being reported. It's become much more sophisticated now than it was initially. And in terms of weighing data, there's a few articles in there or a few of the YouTube channel or the videos have an evidence-based pyramid, and what you would be able to decide, like what's practice changing, is something that has a randomized controlled trial, preferably placebo-controlled and fairly large, against a standard of care. And then you would basically, if it proves to be better without causing any harm, then you would basically do a practice change. So when I'm saying practice changing, that's what I mean. And I can give you a link to that as well if you'd like. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if I hit it.
I'll definitely have that video. I think it was COVID data, navigating sources and numbers. I think, just on that note with regards to data, I think for me, the biggest thing was really like you said, a lack of contextualization of data. And I think, at least tell me if I'm wrong here, but the way that I always saw cases was a proxy for new infections, because new infections is what we cared about. But cases always have a delay in terms of time. As well, there's a huge issue with the potential for duplicated data, especially as we prolong the time frame. I think for the listener, the way that I've always described the duplication of data was the only way that they could account for multiple cases from the same person is if they did 2 tests at the same time for the same person. But if they did 2 tests on 2 different days, it would be counted multiple times. Can you speak to that in terms of, is that an accurate sort of assessment of what cases are valuable for and why there's limitations?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many issues with case counts in general. So I think to your point, I agree with you that we always thought that it was meaning that the person was infectious. We now know that the PCR test, which is the main tool that we've been using to, guide ourselves and count cases, has a large, false positive rate. And that's because it detects genetic material that can't distinguish between prior and current infections. So you could have had an infection and recovered from it. And then, now you're being, tested and you have, you're become positive, but it's because your immune system, has recovered and is now holding on to parts of that virus in order to make antibodies and I don't know, it just has remnants of genetic material. And so, one of the things that we always thought was that, it would reflect infection, whereas clinically what you usually do is you test for symptoms and you diagnose based on symptoms and you confirm with pathology or a test. And so we kind of, another one of the curious things that we did in this whole thing was we said, we'll test first and we'll make that the primary diagnosis. And then we had to develop this weird category called asymptomatic spread, because we were like, and there's people who are testing positive without symptoms. They must be infectious, but without symptoms. That's strange, right?
Isn't that new?
Instead of...
is that a new perspective?
Oh yeah, no, it's a little bit backwards, right? So before they would say if they don't have clinical symptoms, then we would never test for anything. So then they would be negative. It's a negative diagnosis. So all of a sudden here we're like, oh, the test is positive, so that must be that they're clinically infective, which is really not true because it doesn't rule out the fact that you could have a false positive, right? So here, what we were doing is they use that to fuel fear that your neighbor then is spreading the disease to you. Whereas anybody who was looking at the data carefully would have basically said, oh, why don't we rule out the possibility that it's a false positive test? So again, that would be another one of those curious things like, they should know better than to make that assumption. And if they did want to make that assumption, then considering the impact that's having on everybody, what they should have done is they should have tested for infectivity and compared the two. So they would have said, let's do a viral culture, which is the test for infectivity, and see how it correlates with the PCR test. So considering that we've been a year and a half, and that I think the first study that actually did that, looking at asymptomatic spread came out in December, which was almost a full year after the pandemic started. And that, in that particular study, that was, Chinese, it was a retrospective review of 10 million Chinese people who had recovered from COVID. And, what they did was they tested them all and they looked at people who had asymptomatic spread, and then they followed them down, and they realized that, even though they were asymptomatic, they didn't test positive for the virus at all. And they traced all of their contacts. Nobody got an infection from them. So, that would have immediately disproved the theory of asymptomatic spread. And of course, a little bit later, we find out that the PCR test was never intended to measure infection and has been not correctly utilized. So then, so all of a sudden we now, okay, asymptomatic spread isn't a thing. So do we need to be social distancing, and do we need to be locked down, and do we need to have all these measures? And so even though all this new data came in, nobody, including the people who should be looking at this, are adjusting our plan. So again, our team thought that was very curious. We're wondering why that is. Why aren't we asking increasingly more sophisticated questions, and why aren't we analyzing it in a way that ensures that our policies are appropriate? It's one thing to have some graces initially, but science should prevail ultimately. So I'm not 100% sure why that's happening, but those are some of the things that our team started to think was relatively curious. Like, why are lockdowns such a thing now? And asymptomatic spread, and then the notion of masks. Why would we all of a sudden think that a virus that's that size would not be spreading via aerosol spread, which is what would be normally expected? And why would we think that, a mask could stop that, knowing that the viruses are so small, and it's the actual fibers and circuitous nature of the fabric that is the stuff that stops the virus. And that any hole or gap would allow the virus to escape. Why would we think that a mask would help? That should have easily been disproven right out of the gate. And yet, to this day, we're still, recommending masks. So there's a number of curious elements to the interventions that we've, undertaken with little contextualization, a lack of sophistication in terms of analysis, and unfortunately, no course correction, which, we thought was a little bit concerning. And as we continued, it just seemed like, okay, so they're not, nuancing the data properly. Okay. And they're not, extrapolating, they're using, low levels of evidence, like for instance, case reports, which is the Chinese situation, to extrapolate to the whole world without any control. They're, recommending masks. They're creating a new thing called asymptomatic spread.
Yeah, continue
anyway.
Curiosity.
Yes, I mean the idea of asymptomatic spread. I guess for me, I don't consider myself the sharpest tool in the shed. So when something makes sense to me, it must be true. So the idea that asymptomatic, like to me, I just couldn't wrap my head around how you can be sick with something and not show any signs of it.
Or even better, be sick to the point of being able to share it with somebody without knowing yourself.
Yeah, and I always found that kind of weird.
Mm-hmm. So, we kind of lean towards, okay, so that could be a thing, right? That's hypothesis generating. It's always the beginning of a good line of inquiry. So let's follow that through and look where the data leads. The initial, I guess where the whole idea of asymptomatic spread came from was they were, these cases that were, emerging from China, in some of the other Asian countries. And they noticed that, so-and-so came and they had an asymptomatic disease, but then somebody else caught it. And, before their symptoms came. And so it must be asymptomatic spread. They did all these projections and this modeling, and lo and behold, that must be the answer. And then all of a sudden put the whole world on alert. This is what the case is. So I really would have preferred to see some better inquiry and some more rigorous testing and some validation before we adopted some of these policies, internationally. And I personally think that it's curious that, given that it's a year and a half and the social and economic toll that all of this has taken, that we haven't gotten to the bottom of a lot of those questions with some good science. Mm-hmm. And yet we've continued to pursue those policies in the absence of that science, even at great harm to society. So I guess that comes back to another piece for our team is that, we're committed, we're a little bit of that, making sure that people have, truth, like we're like pursuers of truth. And so, making sure to equip people with the ability to navigate the data and ask the questions and learn the scientific methods so that they can discern whether what policymakers are doing and recommending is actually really reasonable. And to ask for better data if we can, and to ask better questions and to make better choices for themselves. Yeah, so that's kind of how we got into the whole thing. And that's how we kind of shifted over to COVID. And I think our team together has probably we've put about 700 hours into this, researching various aspects of COVID and getting to the bottom of it. And yeah, so, when we've teamed up with a great organization called the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, and they're like 200 scientists strong. And now we're collaborating with them to kind of get to the bottom of a lot of this science and see, whether it stands up to more rigorous scrutiny, and to see whether some of this policy is really, grounded in the appropriate level, that have the appropriate levels of support in terms of evidence for what they're doing. So I don't know, Joel, did that answer your question about, how we got into this?
Yeah. And I think, at least this is my super simple summary, that I think you've sort of, what you've said about, the things that we've changed without, let's say, a normal standard of evidence, and then the evidence that's come in that's sort of gone against a lot of the things. I like to say to people, especially in a Christian perspective, reverting back to the Christian principle of quarantining the sick is the one thing that's, logical, and everything else sort of still seems to be very difficult to substantiate with data.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Joel, what do you mean about quarantining the sick?
Just think about how they treated leopards or lepers.
Okay.
Right? In the Bible, that when someone is sick and infectious, yes, quarantining them is an appropriate response. But essentially we're quarantining the healthy. With lockdowns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting dynamics from a cultural perspective that are at play too, right? Mm-hmm. So, this pandemic isn't in the absence, it's not in a vacuum, in the sense that we're in a cultural moment, right? Where we've had a series of, where victim politics, I don't even know how to better say it, but like where we identify a group that's been oppressed or hurt or is vulnerable, and then all of society needs to then move to accommodate this group, right? And we've had a number of different, experiences of that over the last number of years based on different profiles of group. But I don't think that this is, this has a lot of the same attributes the whole pandemic began by, oh my goodness, our elderly are vulnerable, and therefore we all need to lock down. So, it's kind of interesting to see our cultural moment and science intersect. I think we've seen it from a societal perspective, but then to start to see us say, wait a second, in medicine, what we always do is the risk benefit harm, it's a clinical benefit ratio. So do the benefits outweigh the risks for the person who is being treated or has the disease? And so all of a sudden we've done this really interesting shift where we've said, okay, there's a person that's vulnerable and could be at risk. Therefore, all of society should now shift in order to accommodate them. Mm-hmm. So it's a very curious dynamic that's entered into the medical world, where it's shifted the clinical benefit ratio from an individual person's thing to a collective position. And I think that a lot of that dynamic has been at play in this pandemic.
The concept of for the greater good seems to be, at play there. And I don't know the specifics, but I always thought there was this, medical principle regarding, if something is harmful to the individual and i.e. the risk is greater than the benefit, the argument for the greater good is basically invalid. Am I wrong there? Is there a medical principle there?
There's the Hippocratic Oath, which says at first do no harm, right? Mm-hmm. So for sure, but then I don't know if it's particularly so, but it's always been at the individual level, right? There's no such precedent as a collective thing, but any collective thing that you would do would always be limited by not harming an individual. So that would be the basis, for instance, medical ethics applied to public health would be, you can do a societal intervention, but you have to make sure that people can opt out, and you have to make sure that it does no harm to any given segment, and that everybody has a say in whether they want to participate or not. So for instance, our whole society went into lockdowns, which was a medical intervention. However, it was missing a lot of those ethical elements, which is ensuring that it's not going to harm anybody, ensuring that people can opt out, and ensuring that we had a say in the matter. So a lot of these are very shocking, I would say, changes in what would normally be protocol. And I think what's curious about it, particularly, is that it seems to be adopted at multiple levels. And, institutions and bodies and organizations who you would think would be able to apply these basic principles are not doing so. So, there's lots to look at in this COVID pandemic, because a lot of the ways that we've traditionally done things and a lot of the standards that we've used and a lot of the principles that we've applied in order to ensure that no harm is done have kind of been, I guess, put aside. Mm. So, and it's across the board for a number of these things.
With, I guess, with respect to the, the vaccines and the phase that we're at, or I guess the phase that we've been in for 2021, sort of in the rolling out of those, and obviously the limited data that does exist, I'm guessing that's what, your investigation into that data is sort of what led to the two playlists on the covidsence page, which is, COVID vaccines and then informed consent. Can you speak to, what you've seen in the data, what's good about the data with regards to the vaccine, what's concerning or what's missing, and why those two playlists, why those, sort of groups of videos, what was the purpose there?
Yeah, those are good questions. It's so funny because we really started off by saying, we're just going to take a broad sweep and we're going to talk about all these topics, lockdowns and masks and, the list, right? It's what everybody's talking about. And then, we'll do vaccines and as part of that whole process. And then of course, vaccines started rolling out and we started to get a little bit concerned with the way, we've been concerned with a lot of the different interventions up to date. Up to this point. And then all of a sudden, early this year, the vaccines started to roll out and, we're like, well, thank goodness there's something to get us out of this crazy mess, right? And we're like, if there's a vaccine that's going to get us out, we'll take it, right? And so we're joking around in our team, and we're, and then somebody said, oh, you know what? Like, let's take a look at the studies and see what they look like, right? Because vaccines are always safe and effective, right? So that's pretty much how they've been positioned for us as consumers. And so we took a look at the safety profile, and we're used to working in chemotherapy with cytotoxics, right? So our area is different than what you would normally be looking at for vaccines, because there's different standards and burdens of proof that you need for various agents depending on how safe they are. So, for instance, in cancer treatments, you need to have, because they're toxic, you have to have a high burden of proof in order to be able to prescribe it for anybody, or to administer it, or to make sure that that becomes a standard of care. And you have to really prove that it's more beneficial than the standard that you have. So for what that actually looks like is, they start off with really advanced cancer patients, and then they move up a little earlier, and then they move up a little earlier. And, when it comes to treating people who are, newly, have just been diagnosed with cancer, the study sizes are big, they're long lasting, they're very rigorous, they're very nuanced. You break down all the data, you figure out who's benefiting and who's not. You only give it to the people who are benefiting, and you don't give it to the people who don't. So that's the kind of level or standard of evidence that you see with something that's toxic, right? But it doesn't necessarily apply to vaccines, because generally speaking, they're biologically inactive. And when you say they're biologically inactive, what that really means is that they don't have any effect in and of themselves. They're usually attenuated or dead viruses that are administered intramuscularly. They remain in the shoulder. Basically, your immune system identifies them, develops antibodies to the virus, and then you basically have what you call sterilizing immunity. So the most that you would see with a vaccine would be, a little bit of local reaction. So if you look at the studies historically, that's what you would see. So we were looking at these COVID-19 vaccine studies, and our expectation was biologically inactive, a little bit of shoulder pain. And then we looked at the systemic adverse event profile, and what that means, it's the side effects. The systemic means that the ones that, aren't local but go through your whole body. Mm-hmm. And we looked at the systemic AE profile, and we're like, what the heck is that? Like, that looks like chemotherapy. That looks like a cytotoxic agent. This is definitely not something that is biologically inactive. And, so we had this big joke, right? We're like, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, would that be more so related to the not so much COVID, but the mRNA? Or like, because I'm assuming if you look at the more traditional ones, would you still see those? Or is it hard to decipher?
No, you wouldn't see that. It's a very unusual side effects profile. And that really caught our attention, because you just usually don't have, you'll have mild side effects. And this, you had I think there's 15% of people have such severe side effects that they're not able to carry about their daily activity, and or are hospitalized and or die, right? That's the level of side effects that we're seeing with these vaccines, right? So our whole team was like, what is happening? They better have some really good data to prove that this is, if they're going to be administering this to healthy people, right? Then all of a sudden the need for burden of proof, if you have something that's this toxic, should be very, very, very high, right? So then we started to dig down into it, and we realized that, just a little bit of background. So for vaccines, you want to prevent disease. So that's different than treating disease. So when you're treating disease, you basically say, okay, if you're super healthy and you don't have a big risk of disease, even if you give early treatment for cancer, it's still an individual clinical benefit ratio, right? It's basically, am I going to benefit from this if I take it? If not, but you really want to make sure that you're not going to do them more harm than good. So then you want to prove what it is. And that usually involves large randomized controlled trials that go on for years, right? So in the vaccine world, because we're dealing with usually safe and non-toxic, biologically inactive agents, you basically don't need the same burden of proof. So what they do is they test it in healthy volunteers. Ideally, you want the trial to go on for 2 to 3 years. And then you may want to do, phase 3B trials, which are basically trials where you open it up to other subgroups. So you start with healthy people, and then you might open it up to the elderly, or you might look at a subpopulation that you want to make sure it's safe in. So then you would kind of do these kind of extension trials. But in the vaccine world, what's interesting is the use of surrogate endpoints. And I know that this is sounding really technical, but a surrogate endpoint, so like if you have a clinical endpoint, like for instance, cancer, it could take 10 years for the cancer to come back. So that's a long time to wait to see if something works, right? So then what would be easier is if they had a surrogate, right? So, so one of the surrogates would be how much did such and such lab value change or something like that. So in vaccines, they basically measure what they call antibody titers. So if you can develop antibodies to something, then they say, well, then we assume that that's going to have a clinical benefit. It's going to help you fight the disease later on, right? Or if you can, in this particular case with COVID, if we can lower the case numbers, then we'll assume that means that it's actually going to help lower hospitalizations and death. So you don't actually prove that it lowers hospitalizations and death. You just say, oh, I'm going to consider it as a surrogate, right? But surrogates aren't as convincing when you're looking at toxic therapies. So with these vaccine trials, here they've all of a sudden introduced a toxic vaccine, which I think would probably be better termed a gene therapy or a biologic, which is not biologically inactive. And they've called it a vaccine. And because they've positioned it as a vaccine, it is then only having to do the same level of proof as something that's very safe, which I think was probably inappropriate in my view. So basically what they did was that phase 1-2 studies, they showed in 45 healthy individuals that it could develop, that they would cause antibodies, which is a good sign, right? But it doesn't prove that it stops disease or infection. And then in the actual phase 3 studies, which were large and robust and quite well designed, the primary endpoint, which is the only thing that you can really prove, was symptomatic cases of the disease. So, they basically said if you've got more or less cases in one arm than the other, then we'll be able to assume that it improves things like severe disease, hospitalization, and death. However, the studies were only run for 2.5 months. And although the cases were different between the two arms, they didn't have any controls for exposure. And they didn't have systematic testing in the two groups. So it was basically at the discretion of the physician whether they were to be tested. And then now we also now know that the test that they were using, the PCR test, isn't able to distinguish between active and previous infections. So all of that to say is that the cases as an endpoint, which was what the study was powered to do, isn't really convincing when you look at the data. There were also incredible levels of people that were lost to follow-up. And whenever I make a point about that, if your event rate, which is the number of cases, is lower than than the number of people that were just dropped out of the study, then you have to question the reliability of the results. So all of this to say is at the end of the day, we hear lots of reports about the vaccines work. So I would question whether they lower cases, and then they lower severe disease, but it didn't have any power to detect if it lowers severe disease. It didn't measure death, and it didn't measure transmission of the disease. So a lot of the claims that are being made around these trials are probably not supported by available data. Based on the phase 3 trial, which is what you're supposed to have. Pardon?
Are they inferring from, like, let's say, standard vaccine perspective, or just unsubstantiated is probably the best way to think about it?
I would personally say that it's unsubstantiated, but their confidence may be drawing on the fact that they've got, they consider antibodies a surrogate endpoint. So, that could be coloring it. They could also be inferring the fact that if the cases go down, then that means that the disease is being controlled. But again, I don't think that that's, probably supported for the type of intervention that they're doing. It might be supported if they were saying offering vaccines to everybody. But, in Canada right now, we're at the point where we're mandating vaccination, which means that regardless of whether it's beneficial for the individual, society is asking people to begin to get vaccinated. And I wouldn't say that the level of data supports that type of an intervention, forceful intervention.
Okay. I'm glad you brought up the idea of vaccine mandates, and your article was really good on that issue. The point I wanted you to just give some commentary on was, you said, are vaccine mandates legal? And in it, you said, just to jog your memory, Canada is a free society, and we have the right to medical privacy, informed consent, freedom of movement, and bodily autonomy. These rights are protected under the Nuremberg Code, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and Canadian law. For a government to mandate vaccination, they would have to ensure that it did not violate the rights of its citizens or the laws of the land. Nicholas Wansbutter, a criminal lawyer, explains how these mandates not only violate our rights and freedoms, but could be considered assault under Canadian law. Can you expound on that for us, please?
Okay, Nicholas did a way better job in the law department than I.
Right. Well, I mean, just an overview.
That I did. Begin. Yeah. Well, I guess the piece around the Nuremberg Code is really the heart of informed consent. And informed consent means that you have access to all of the information around a treatment that's being made or that you're being offered. You have full access to the risks and benefits, that you have the ability to weigh the risks and benefits for yourself and to make sure that the benefits outweigh the harms, and that you're able to do so with assistance and free of coercion. So a mandate, if I were to come in and say, I require you to do this, and I know, and it hasn't been proven that it can't harm me, would be a violation of the Nuremberg Code of informed consent. In terms of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have the freedom to choose basically what happens to us, and we have the right to bodily autonomy, means that we get to decide what goes into us. So any type of, a mandate would be limiting your interaction with the public in public life. You're limiting your ability to work, limiting your ability to interact with people based on something. Well, basically, it's a violation of your rights and freedoms. And to think that we're doing this without a very, very strong level of evidence. And I haven't gotten into the safety of the vaccines, but it is definitely proven that they are not safe for everybody. So to require everybody to have that would be a violation of our charter's rights and freedoms. And then the Canadian law is, if you voluntarily and willfully administer something to somebody else that could harm them, that's called assault.
Interesting. Yeah, because I guess, for us, sometimes not sometimes, but most of the population, we're not familiar with what our rights are, what our freedoms are, and what's allowed and what's not to be allowed. And kind of, we have a statist mindset where we're kind of like, okay, well, if the government says it, then it must be right or it must be true. But of course, there definitely are, there is a group of people in society that definitely don't believe that and are always critical of what's being said.
I think that, as Christians, we're to be seekers of truth, right?
Yep.
And
like the Bereans.
So, yeah, we're supposed to be critical thinkers, always considering things. And one of the things is that, truth and love go hand in hand, right? So you can't actually be loving unless you're truthful. So for instance, if I say to you, oh yes, this is going to be good for you, but meanwhile, I know that it's going to be harmful, and I say you need to do it, then I'm not being loving at all, right? So as Christians, we really need to be always considering this intersection. And if somebody is not a Christian, they might be motivated by whatever reason to manipulate truth in order to be able to gain something for themselves. And invariably what that'll do is it'll end up harming somebody who's vulnerable. So as Christians, we're called to be seekers of truth, to stand in love, but also to protect the vulnerable and the oppressed, right? So I think that, something like vaccine mandates is a perfect area where the evidence does not substantiate it. There's clear evidence of harm, and it will invariably, because one solution never fits everyone for any treatment, and let alone a biologically active toxic vaccine. We are actually endorsing harm to segments of society by allowing this. And so, I would argue as Christians that it's our that we're required to stand up where we see violations of truth, and that it is our duty to call out government, as Jesus did, when they're not standing in truth and when they are harming people.
Can you? I think you already did it, but I think it's because you've used the term a bunch, and I think for people that are relatively ignorant to the subject, can you define what you mean by toxic again? When you say this is a toxic vaccine. Again, I think you already did it, but I just thought it's probably a good point.
Yeah. So we go through that in our safety. Yeah. So our safety video, our vaccine safe. So that's probably a really great source if you want to kind of do a deeper dive, and we explain it there. But so basically, usually vaccines are inert. Like, they're not biologically active. Therefore, the most you'll get is like a little bit of an injection site pain. Whereas whenever you look at the safety profile, and this is in the published phase 3 trials for the COVID vaccines, what you see is there's a column called any adverse events. And in this particular depiction, you see that 55% of people who take this vaccine will get so sick that they won't be able to carry on their daily activities. So they'll have trouble carrying on their daily activities. So that's unusual. You should not see that in a vaccine. And curiously, a lot of the symptoms, the side effects, are COVID-like symptoms. So fever, headache, fatigue, myalgia, arthralgia, chills. So that is an odd representation. And 15% of people will get so sick that they won't even be able to carry out their daily activities. They'll be incapacitated. So this is not something that would be considered safe in any regards, not even in cancer world, let alone when we're talking about administering this to healthy people, especially children, pregnant women, the elderly, especially the frail elderly. These are groups of people where because with children and infants in the womb, the number of quality life years that are on the line, if you do some harm, the cost is tremendous. With the frail elderly, they don't have a lot of reserves and they're very fragile. So if something happens and they get something that's toxic, it could kill them. So that's when I say toxic, that's what I mean. Is that the actual side effects profile would be considered toxic by any definition. I would think anybody who's looking at that fairly would probably have to conclude that, except for it is notable that, every time that these peer-reviewed trials published in New England Journal of Medicine conclude at the end, they're like, and we say that these are safe and effective. But I would not say that that's supported by the actual findings in the trial.
There was a point that you made under the point about do vaccine mandates make sense, and there was this interesting stat that was helpful, and they gave me like a framework to think about the mandates, and it says this: experts say that if a vaccine is 90% effective, 55% of the population will need to get vaccinated to halt the spread of the virus. But in Ontario, 82% of eligible people have now undergone voluntary vaccination, including vulnerable persons. So in theory, no one should be at risk, right? And so now, but we're still mandating mandatory vaccinations. Could you elaborate on that and just comment?
Yeah, it's a curious position that the state is taking. The government's taking, because if you think about an individual point of view, anybody who's at risk of disease and wants to be protected can be protected. Therefore, there's no requirement for anybody else to do anything. There's no societal burden or obligation for anybody else to do anything, because if these vaccines work, then the person will be protected, right? Then there's this concept called herd immunity that's very popular in the vaccine world, and it basically says that there's some people that can't take the vaccine and can't be protected. They're vulnerable. Therefore, it's the onus is on the healthy people to develop immunity, right? Or whenever they develop immunity, the vaccine stops spreading, and therefore the vulnerable people which can't fight the disease won't get affected or infected. So, however, the way that these vaccines are being positioned is that they're safe and effective for everybody. And so if they're safe and effective for everybody and everybody has access to them, then there's no burden on anybody else to need to do anything. So if that's the case, if they are effective at 95%, then this needing to get 100% vaccination is really not substantiated logically, either at an individual or a societal level. So it's curious that we're pursuing this with such aggression, putting people's lives on the line.
And vacations.
Their livelihoods, their vacations. I mean, we're putting everything on the line, right? Mental health. So much of our society is being, and I think that really what we need to be doing, and especially as Christians, is questioning whether this is actually a logical thing. And I could argue from a medical standpoint that it's unsubstantiated. So I think that basically begs to question, well, then what's driving this? And if you wanted to get into economic conversations, we could kind of segue that way a little bit, because I've got a pharmaceutical background.
Yes, please.
I would just want to say, when you were talking at the intro about sort of your motivation for getting into your, doing the business for yourself, I so, appreciated that, because, I look at sort of the incentives with regards to, just take the vaccine industry as a whole. And when you remove manufacturer liability, you're going to skew incentives. And so, not to go necessarily a total critique of that industry, but the whether it be the conversation about therapeutics with COVID, a lot of people are putting forward the idea that, well, there's no money here, and the motivations in the industry are very much going in that direction. And so I guess I would ask you first, what did you see? Can you break down a little bit of what you saw that in getting into the industry that really drove you there? And then, we can speak to with regards to COVID.
Yeah. So, Big-Pharma is big and powerful. And I'm going to say right out of the gate that they do a lot of good. And, I've worked with some top-notch companies that have done fantastic research and have been behind some amazing breakthroughs. And they're fueled by people with integrity that work hard and are super smart. I would own all of that. But there is a side to pharma where it's motivated by profits, and you're ultimately beholden to your shareholders. And so there's always a pressure towards performance. And, ultimately speaking, you want to make sure that there's an ethical line that doesn't get crossed and that principles are upheld. However, there's always a continual tension between, the wanting to make sure, what if we just bend this one thing or all this? And there's lots of regulation in place that creates firm boundaries. You don't go past this point and don't say this and do say this. However, I think we would all have to just acknowledge that there is a pressure to come up against those boundaries in order to gain, to make more money. And so, when I was working within pharma, I felt that pressure all the time. Personally, I was committed to always relaying things accurately and in a balanced fashion, but I did feel that there was a pressure continually to bend it towards something that would benefit the company that you were doing. And it came at a number of different levels. It could be just, what you talked about or who you interacted with or what topics you focused on or what you got behind. But it shows up right across the board. And, for me, cancer is such an important thing my father passed away because of cancer, and so I'm pretty committed to making sure that the best available care is made available to Canadians. And so, I wanted to be able to create an infrastructure where we could have national collaboration and where it was completely arm's length from pharma, and we could do these analyses directly with the doctors. So, and following evidence-based principles so that, the best recommendations would be made. And if they were favorable to pharma, great. And if they weren't, they weren't. But, the bottom line was that they would always be favorable to the patient. So that's kind of what I got into. However, pharma is a business and I'm a businesswoman. And so I recognize a good business model when I see one, and vaccines are great business. And I'll explain why they're great business relative to other things. So if you think from a marketing standpoint, whenever you want to develop a treatment, basically there's a population that you treat. So when you start launching a product, you would treat a very specific population. Say, I'm just going to give the example of cancer. So advanced cancer patients, let's say they've received lots of prior treatment and they probably only have 2 months to live. So, maybe we'll call that 100 patients, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you'll make some money, but you have to go through the whole development cycle of proving that it's good for that particular group, which can be very costly. And you can think a treatment's going to work, and then at the end, they would do the randomized controlled trial and it's a failure. Mm-hmm. So there's a tremendous amount of money that goes into development, conducting this clinical research in order to get even a small, what they call niche market, which would be like super advanced cancer. And so the goal in the pharmaceutical industry is to move forward earlier in treatment. The earlier you go in treatment, the more patients you get. So you get a bigger, what is called market. I know it sounds terrible to be thinking about this, but it's a stage-wise thing. And at each threshold, you have to prove that you're better than what's the standard of care, and then you get to go to a bigger market and a bigger market. Well, vaccines are the biggest market ever because you don't even need to be sick to need a vaccine. You just need to be alive, right? And so if you can convince somebody that they need a vaccine when they have no symptoms and they don't need treatment, right? Then that's the biggest market possible. All that you need to be is a healthy adult. And I mean, the vaccine industry, basically, there's a lot of vaccines that are administered to children, and all that children need to do is be born and they're eligible for the vaccine. And then we make calculated, risk benefit analysis saying, well, this will prevent such and such a disease, which has terrible side effects. So we're going to do this, child benefit by giving them this vaccine. So, a lot of the emphasis then moves from the realm of evidence, in the sense that it does do help, to the realm of speculation, where I think that this would benefit somebody. So again, it becomes much more easy to convince somebody that they need to take a treatment whenever you're thinking of prevention, because all that you need to do is scare them into thinking that they'll get sick. So it's easy. It's good business, right? And it's a lot less risky than having to prove that something works or not. And a lot of the time, the prevention trials, if you were to do a proper prevention trial, it would take 20 years. Like, say, for instance, you say, oh, I think it's going to stop cancer. Well, you would have to wait. Cancer takes 10, 20 years to show. So you'd have to wait 10 or 20 years. Now, that's just not a viable marketing. It's just not viable from a development. It's a super costly trial to do. The loss to follow up. I mean, it's super expensive. So nobody's going to want to do that trial. So then what you do is these surrogate endpoint trials where you basically say, oh, it developed antibodies, therefore it will prevent disease, which you might get. So anyways, I guess it moves from, I guess instead of the level of the burden of evidence getting higher, which it should for healthy patients, the standard is that it's quite low.
That's
and as long as you can develop antibodies. Yeah, it's a bit strange, but from a business point of view, that's down. You don't have to trials that go on for years. You just have to show that a surrogate endpoint changes, and you're able to So there's a lot of motivation for pharmaceutical companies to find, to invest in vaccines because of that. I'm not saying that they haven't prevented disease and that they don't have a role, but I'm just saying that in terms of a business perspective, it's the pot of gold, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now, historically, it's important for you to also understand that there's regulations that have been involved. So in terms of what you can do is, if you're a company and you promote, once you have something that you think works, then you're allowed to you can have qualified people who are allowed to talk to doctors about it, right? And then, you can't talk directly to patients. You're not allowed. It's called marketing. You can market to doctors, right? You can present your best, message to a doctor, but you're not allowed to present your best message to a patient because the patient isn't qualified to discern that level of data. And then a little while ago, they basically started to say, well, you can advertise, which would be kind of directly talking to the patient. But, if you do a commercial that's presenting your best message or whatever it is, marketing campaign, you need to have all the side effects, so you'll see, such and such does amazing things for you. And it causes heart disease and like those weird commercials that you see where they have to qualify everything, right? But a little while ago, one of the things that started to happen that was really kind of interesting, which was good for pharma, was that they started to realize if they work through patient groups, advocacy groups, that they could basically influence politicians, manipulate
you mean like lobby
politicians
groups?
towards a certain end. Yeah. So, for instance, a good example would be the breast cancer advocacy group. So, they started talking to these groups, and they're not allowed to talk to people, but then they get the advocacy groups to talk to their peers. And so they're kind of indirectly marketing to patients. That happened, I don't know, about 4 or 5 years ago. And then it went from there to they get those advocacy groups then to do campaigns towards government to get them to recommend certain treatments, right?
Yes,
so then all of a
seeking.
sudden, so all of a sudden pharmaceutical companies are getting more leverage, right? So they're able to, they're able to kind of get access to people more and to influence people more. And of course, historically, we've always said that people should not be marketed to because they don't have a level of sophistication to discern whether it is actually good for them or not, right? So, a marketing campaign will, connect something to emotion, minimize harm, maximize benefits. That's just what they do when you market, right? And so it violates people's informed consent because they're not able to carefully weigh the pros and cons of a given treatment.
Yeah.
So
and
then,
it's funny. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
go ahead. No.
No. Finish your thought.
But anyways, it went to another level where then they started to liaise directly with governments and started to say that there's a cost benefit analysis, it's called, where they would go to governments and they would say, this disease costs you so much to treat, let's just say cancer, right? It's billions of dollars in budget. And, we could save you a lot of money by vaccinating this group of patients. It will save you money in the end. And so then all of a sudden, government was like, wow, we've got, social health care, central health care. And so that's a big budget line, right? So if I can minimize that somehow, that's really interesting to me. And so then there's this collaboration between government and vaccines companies, or companies with vaccines, that began, where the governments were kind of getting into it with the pharmaceutical companies because it saved money. So then you've got this interesting thing where the government was really supposed to be the regulator, the independent body that's protecting the patients from undue influence from pharma, and yet then all of a sudden you get the government kind of partnering with pharma then to promote these vaccines to the people. Now there's no regulation that prevents a government from marketing to its people.
Right.
And so what you start to see is more and more of that where, public health will require vaccination then. for various activities. And you saw a lot of that earlier, like vaccines for school and stuff like that. So that's kind of this partnership now between government, and now it's not the pharmaceutical companies that are promoting it to the people. It's the government that is promoting it or marketing to its people. And if it's unethical for pharmaceutical companies to do it, then it's questionable whether it's ethical for governments to do it. And so then with this pandemic, it was incredible because not only did governments move into an active role of promoting vaccines, but they basically disregarded all of the rules of informed consent. And a lot of the campaigning was basically specifically related to it's a marketing campaign where they do the classic thing where they emphasize the benefits and minimize the risk, and they obscure details so that the consumer isn't actually able to make an informed choice. And interestingly enough, the consumer is their actual citizen that the government is supposed to be protecting, but now is being, is now the focus of their consumption. Do you know what I mean? Like that's they feel that they're successful if they convince the person that they're trying to protect to take this, which, probably isn't a terrible thing if you have a safe and effective vaccine. But the thing that I find extremely concerning about this, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, I'll let you finish. I was just going to apply a terminology to it. So.
Yeah, so that it would be great if it's a safe and effective vaccine, but it isn't. And so what we have here now is government, not even, it moved from, active participation in promotion, then a violation of informed consents by using what I would call propaganda and marketing, actively marketing to it. And now they're moving to coercion through vaccine mandates. And so it's a very concerning ethical situation that we're in, where government feels that it's warranted. However, I don't think that it would be substantiated by any normal standards of evidence. And I think it's just inappropriate that a government would be engaging in that type of relationship with the citizens that it's supposed to be protecting.
Yeah, and I think part of the issue is people don't even realize that that medicine isn't necessarily a foregone conclusion, and people have different philosophies on medication and on medicine, and how far people will go with their medicine. So sometimes you'll hear about people where they're saying, "Oh, yeah, my auntie just went to have her uterus removed." Right? And you're kind of like, whoa, wait, what would you have to do to, is there another option? Right? Kind of like when we go to the doctors and we say, actually, I want to get a second opinion. And in sports, right? They're like, actually, let me get a second opinion. Actually, that's how we got Kawhi. Kawhi got a second opinion and was like, yo, I'm out of there. So it's important for us to realize that we have to respect people's philosophies on medicine and how they see it. So, for example, just in my framework and the way I see it is, all medicines have side effects, right? And nothing is perfect. There isn't like a silver bullet that cures all things. And so I'm weary when people are telling me about this vaccine or other things, and they're not telling me about what's behind the curtain. So these are things we have to be mindful of.
Yeah, and I think that even some people that I talk to that aren't necessarily medically trained, are like, man, that sounds like very homogeneous messaging, right? Like, I'm 100% sure, the way out of a pandemic is much more nuanced than take your vaccine. Like, if every other problem in society is more nuanced, then why isn't this one, right? And, how can you continue to say it's safe and effective if, there's 13,000 deaths in the the VAERS database, which is the adverse events database, right? Like, is that really true? Like, are we really? Oh yes, no, vaccines are always safe and effective, and it's good for you. I think the other thing that we need to really remember when we're thinking about treatment is that, there's a broad, the population is very different. what's good for you might not be good for me based on, our history, our comorbidities, our treatment past, different factors that are going on, so it's never, one size fits all. And so I think that, that's called personalized medicine. It's where you take something and you look at the person's personal situation and then you customize a treatment accordingly. So, the fact that we're doing one size fits all medicine in a time when our level of sophistication is quite advanced is very curious. And the other thing too is that if you were to look at, things that alternate treatments, whether they're nutraceuticals or, things like ivermectin or fluvoxamine or other things that have now got randomized phase 3 trial and against standards of care and do show benefits in terms of the clinical endpoints that we were talking about, where they have measured things like, not only cases, but severe disease and death, and actually have shown benefit. We're not really acknowledging that, and we're saying that doesn't have a lot of evidence, and yet we're looking at these vaccine trials that were really only done in in healthy patients with a questionable endpoint, without proving that there was improvements in severe disease and death. And we're saying that that's good, and that's the only solution, and there's no other solution. And yet we know that these other things exist with higher levels of evidence and burdens of proof. So it's very curious. I would think that even the average consumer should start to ask questions whenever they hear something that it's just only one solution for everyone. In those phase 3 trials, they didn't actually include pregnant women, for instance. They didn't include the large ones that were done, didn't include children. They didn't include people who were COVID recovered that had pre-existing immunity, and they didn't include immunocompromised people. And then, the moment that these trials were finished, the campaign rolled out, and, they were marketing it to the elderly, the frail elderly, as because they were at higher risk. Well, those people weren't even studied, and then they made a case for, women who were pregnant were at higher risk than non-pregnant people. But if you consider that a number of the people in that particular study were obese, and obesity is a risk factor, and that pregnancy itself is a risk factor, then the differences between the pregnant and the non-pregnant group in that particular study were really, minimal. So I don't think that you could make a good case for women being but then they immediately started treating every single pregnant woman. And I was just reading the Ontario Public Health Bulletin that was saying, and now women can get booster shots because they're in a vulnerable group. And the vaccine has never been tested in women in a randomized controlled trial. And when I say emphasize randomized controlled trial, it's because it's never been tested in a way that can prove that it's both safe and effective for that population. Using it in real world studies and then looking at the data like they have been doing for a CDC is just so open to manipulation and bias and error that, when we're thinking about the lives of unborn children, it just doesn't make sense that you would be that cavalier or casual with your scrutiny. I think, a good way of thinking about this is like if you're in a war zone and, there's enemy fire, enemies all around you, and you want to clear the civilians out of a village, what you do is you go forward and you clear the area and you make sure that there's no enemy there so that when you bring the civilians through, they'll be safe. So what we've done with these vaccines is we've basically kind of taken this position where we say, I don't see any enemy fire, so yeah, pregnant women, go ahead. Right? It's like we're not taking the time to clear. It's not what you do in medicine. Because the adage is do no harm, then you have to prove safety before you give it. So, we've adopted this very strange thing. And I think it's because governments are actively marketing to their people where they're like, if I don't look properly for safety and therefore don't see it, then I will say that it's safe because then I will get them to use the vaccine. Do you get it?
Yep.
So it's minimizing the risk. It's you maximize benefit, you minimize risk in business when you're marketing something. And so they're minimizing the risk by not looking and not doing the proper due diligence. And they're maximizing benefit by extrapolating from surrogate endpoints.
And I think your point earlier regarding sort of the shift in the industry the getting, pharma being way more involved with sort of government as a means to, help mitigate government's medical costs. The term that I think is appropriate is regulatory capture. And, the piece that goes in there, I think for a lot of people is to, they see this like revolving door between these agencies like CDC and FDA, between, the companies are supposed to be regulating. And as an outsider to some extent, you're like, oh, I guess it kind of makes sense, helps them make better decisions because they understand how the system works because they've been on both sides. But the problem with the regulatory capture concept is not that these people are corrupt or incompetent, but that you sort of used the term, or you didn't use this term earlier, but you spoke to the idea of like compartmentalization. And between conflicts of interest and very narrow sort of lifelong, careers, let's say, working with, use vaccine as an example. Oh, I know the benefit. And sort of like, because of that regulatory capture, they're not independent. They're not fulfilling the role that we as society think of them as. Oh, they're the regular. They're protecting the customer. But the way they're protecting the customer is, by lowering the financial burden on the healthcare system to the government, as opposed to, I would say as far as I understand, there's almost no independent study from those regulatory bodies. They're relying on the studies from those companies. And again, as you sort of said, there's the incentive to shift things. And I just want to wrap up with the regulatory capture concept. When you look at the government's sort of like dirty dozen list of, people who are spreading vaccine misinformation, the one guy on there, Robert Kennedy Jr., has an experience going after the government's EPA with regards to regulatory capture. Regarding the coal and mining industry. And so it's peculiar to see someone on that list who has a history of exposing regulatory capture. And I look at it and see, the different things. Like I didn't really realize the stuff you described with regards to the industry sort of shifting, but I did see that revolving door criticize, people going in and out of companies and in and out of the agencies. And so, I just wonder.
Oh, sorry, just on the regulatory capture, but just like a couple last pieces on the business side, and it kind of loops back to this whole mandate thing. Is what's better than having access to a continual market, right? Is the ability to develop a product very cost effectively. So mRNA technology is like having a little printer in your backyard. Usually the development costs for vaccines are extraordinary in the sense you have to go through animal models and testing and all this kind of stuff. And, then you've got to, manufacture your vaccine, and there's all sorts of, regulatory requirements and, standards that you have to meet. But with these mRNA vaccines, basically, they just get these little lipid nanoparticles and, do gene sequencing, which is like really kind of like printing, right? And then it's done. Right. So the cost of manufacturing and the time to which you can actually produce a product is extremely low. So you've got lots of opportunity benefit on that side too, because you don't actually have to, the development cost, the actual manufacturing costs and timelines are compressed and the costs are much lower. So, but then if you can convince people, right. So, on that note, again, remember that the best marketing is done through either appeal to authority or appeal to emotion, right? So if you can convince the whole population that they're terrified, and then the people demand the government do something, right? And then basically the government says, oh my gosh, I'm politically invested in the sense that I don't want to lose my position. So I better move to the will of the people who are terrified. So if you can be a pharmaceutical company or any entity that then can work through these advocacy groups, these people, maybe if you have control of mainstream media and you can terrify everybody by misrepresenting data, then you've got high emotions, and then the people will petition their government to do something, which will then get the government, they're already very involved in vaccines, so they start doing their own thing, and then you get the government to market, so then you don't even have any costs for marketing, right? And on top of that, also, you're supposed to do post-marketing trials, and you can get the governments to do those or even waive the need for it. And then if you keep your fear machine going, then you can convince the people that they need boosters to be safe. So then you can just print something every 4 to 5 months, and it's the the pharmaceutical dream come true, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying that any of that's actually happening,
Just
but
opportunity.
knowing the business and knowing the thing and seeing the pattern, and I watch the pharma headlines, every day. I'm monitoring them continually. And there's a big move between pharmaceutical companies to figure out ways that they can streamline development to make access to good vaccines more effective. And really what that means in marketing or, jumbo terms is that they want to develop a surrogate endpoint whereby, vaccines are now approved just based on antibody titers. So you don't have to do any safety. You don't have to do anything else. We'll just assume that they're effective. And as long as they can produce antibody titers, and they can print these mRNA vaccines for anything.
Mm.
So, if we think that this is stopping here, the government has basically bought enough vaccine boosters for everybody to get one every 2 or 3 months or something like that. And the machine, there's a Moderna plant going in Canada, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to print mRNA vaccines.
Are they hiring?
This is the beginning. Yeah, exactly. This is the beginning of something really quite larger than this, right? And if you can force vaccinate people, even better.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got complete capture.
Even more reason why safety is of utmost importance. It sounds like the technology is very promising and could be very beneficial, but if you're not doing it safely,
and if the government's very active feels very comfortable in just telling people what they need to take, then, I could see how this could get to be very destructive.
Yeah.
And again, they're recommending boosters now, but they haven't done any safety testing to see what the effect of cumulative boosters are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. There's no 3-shot trials.
No, there's no, there was no big gap between the 2 doses trials. There was no mixing and matching trials. There's no booster trials. So all of a sudden, the government kind of went from requiring very little evidence to make a decision to then getting actively and promoting a vaccine, then now to disregarding the need for safety and efficacy altogether and just, unilaterally deciding what's good for us and limiting our livelihoods if we disagree. So I think vaccine mandates are very concerning. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not about, the goodwill. Like, it's not about, you should really help granny by getting your vaccine and stop the spread of the disease, because I don't think it's really about that at all. I think it's about, standing up for medical ethics and our right to informed consent and to be free of coercion whenever it comes to making treatment decisions. It's about personal responsibility in order to maintain our health, and also to make sure that we're taking treatments that are good for us, and while considering others, making sure that they're responsible for keeping themselves safe. And I think too that as Christians, there's a lot of people who've been looking to Romans 13 in terms of saying, we should follow the state.
Mm-hmm.
However, if the state starts to do things that are harmful to large segments of society, and to bend the truth and to coerce and manipulate their people, I think as Christians, we're the first that need to stand and speak up against it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of concern right now. I think, I'm really appreciative of a lot of the inside information you gave, in the sense that, I kept thinking about the economics sort of principles at play in terms of incentives, regulatory capture. We didn't throw this term around yet, but you were talking about governments, and really there's the economic concept of public choice theory. And without getting into it, I always describe it to people. It's like, so many people put themselves in the place of government and think, oh, if it was me, here's how I would act, without really understanding how politicians have such a different level of incentives in the way that they operate and think and make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I always have said from the very beginning, people have asked me, why is this happening? Or what's the motivations? And I always say, for the politician, the biggest concern they have is acting when the public thinks they need to act. Because acting when they shouldn't, they can always say it would have been so much worse. And it's very, very difficult to prove that statement wrong.
That's very true. Yeah. And, I think the last thing for Christians, and I know you want to wrap up, so it'll be my last thought, but, I really think that as Christians, we really need to be looking for idolatry in our hearts, right? And when I think of idolatry, I'm thinking about we've idolized the medical system. We've always looked to the medical system to save us. And I'm the first out there to say that, right? Because I'm actively involved in it. But when you trust an idol blindly, it will always destroy you, right? So I think, there's a lot of blind trust that we've given the medical system. They're a doctor, they must know what they're talking about. And we've just kind of parked our brains. And I don't think that's appropriate for Christians, because we do need to be discerning truth, and we do need to be active in our love, which means that we need to be protecting the vulnerable. And I think we've idolized government. The government will save me from this pandemic, and what they're doing must be right. So, unfortunately, I think a couple of our collective idols, and I think that they've infiltrated the church, are coming home to roost. We're captured now fully by what we trusted.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to wrap up on. I've sort of said, I think a lot of those, the trust in the medical world, the public health institutions, we're going to have a reckoning after all of this, because, the faults or the failures of those systems are, for us, those of us that are looking at the data, I think we're sort of seeing it and realizing, hey, something's not quite right. And it's only a matter of time before people figure it out. So for the listener who, likes what you've said, I will say, if they had any questions about the vaccine safety stuff, definitely check out the covidsence YouTube videos, because I think you broke it down pretty good, but the visual graphics that go with it to demonstrate some of that is really, really helpful to if they want to dig into it and maybe think about it a little bit deeper. But for the listener who wants to connect with you or see your stuff, what would you recommend as like resources or ways to reach out to you?
Well, I think the YouTube channel is probably the best means of kind of getting access to our data. We've got an article that we've published on Trial Site News on vaccines and pregnancy, or COVID and pregnancy. And I think the vaccine mandate one is going to be going up on the Canadian COVID Care Alliance website. So those are all excellent things. And of course, they can always get in touch with me through covidsence@gmail.com. So I'll give you that email so you can share it with your listeners.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. It's definitely been a very informative conversation for me as well. So
yes, definitely. All the best.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your interest and for having this conversation. I think it's important to have, especially in Christian circles.
Agreed. Thank you again. Have a good day.
Bye.
Okay. Bye now.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?
Madden and Mitchell Media.